Group and the Institute of Politics, I'd like to welcome you to our seminar honoring the centennial of Eleanor Roosevelt's birth. For those of you who like to be precise about such things, Eleanor Roosevelt's 100th birthday is actually on October 11th of this year. But we decided to celebrate it now for a number of reasons. First of all, by having it now, this is the first event honoring the centennial of Eleanor Roosevelt's birth in the Boston area, and if I'm not mistaken, it's the first event in the country. And there's something that makes us feel good about being first at this. Second, many of us who are here now and have been working on this would have graduated by the fall, so it wouldn't have done us much good. And third, and most importantly, this is the beginning of Women's History Week. The Kennedy School Women's Group is dedicated to encouraging more women to pursue careers in the public sector. With that as our goal, we could think of no better way to mark the beginning of Women's History Week than with an event of this kind. It's our hope that the speakers and the panel discussions you hear today will not only tell you something more about Eleanor Roosevelt's life, but most importantly, will tell you something more about Eleanor Roosevelt's ideas. It seems to us in these days when budget battles and the escalating arms race and other issues of that kind have been taking up the front of the papers all the time, that other issues that concern people, the human concerns, what we've titled the politics of conscience, often tend to get lost in the shuffle, and we think that's a pity. And it's our hope that this event and other events throughout the year honoring Eleanor Roosevelt will renew the interest of both men and women in these very, very important issues. As for today's seminar, our first speaker will tell you something more about Eleanor Roosevelt, and specifically her ideas and her evolution as a reformer. The panel discussion later this morning and the one this afternoon will take a look at the current status of two issues that Eleanor Roosevelt worked on throughout her life, specifically poverty in America and international human rights. And those panels will also look at some possible solutions to those problems. And as I said earlier, we hope these events will encourage you to become more actively involved in solving many of these problems that face us in this world. With that said, I again want to welcome you to this event, and we can move right on to our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Tamara Harivan. She is a professor of American history at Clark University and is currently working at Harvard Center for Population Studies. She is the author, co-author, or editor of many books, articles, and papers, including the very fine work Eleanor Roosevelt and American Conscience. She's here to speak to us today under the section that we've titled Remembering Eleanor Roosevelt, but as I said earlier, it will be more about her evolution as a reformer and the ideas she worked on throughout her life. We are very pleased to have our first speaker with us today, Tamara Harivan.
Thank you, Nancy. If you can hear me, I will avoid this podium. Can you hear me? I'm very pleased to be here this morning, primarily because Eleanor Roosevelt's existence has somewhat disappeared from our consciousness. And I'm very glad for the opportunity to, on this special occasion and hopefully on many other occasions that will be following, to bring her back into the public mind. There used to be a time in the 1930s when it would have been impossible to open a newspaper without constantly seeing Eleanor Roosevelt's name either praised or denigrated, and it would have been impossible to open a newspaper without seeing one cartoon or another cartoon about Eleanor Roosevelt. And of course, one of the most typical ones was, or the most representative was the one showing a miner down in a pit in West Virginia and looking up into the sky and saying, "Gosh, there comes Eleanor again." Well, Eleanor hasn't come for a while. And I think that the American reform tradition has perhaps suffered from her absence, primarily because above and beyond everything else, she was a conscience. And when I struggled in 1968 to find a title for my book that would properly express the multiplicity of her activities, some consistent and some inconsistent, and when I struggled to find a common pattern, the only word I could find that encompassed everything was an American conscience. And what I was so pleased and surprised this time was when Nancy Steer and her committee were struggling to come up with a title for this conference. They were also at a loss as to how to find an all-encompassing title. And they came up with the word conscience again, because perhaps that, more than anything else, had been Eleanor Roosevelt's major heritage. But I am here this morning not to praise Eleanor Roosevelt. That had been done many times throughout her life, and particularly in the eulogies after her death. And perhaps one of the great moving moments in my own life as a scholar and as a human being was at the 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, when this magnificent eulogy for Eleanor Roosevelt had been delivered at that time, and that was 2 years after her death. What I'm here to do today is to try to assess somewhat this very cross-stitched and varied pattern of her career, to try to understand it in the context of the American reform tradition, and perhaps to draw some lessons from Eleanor Roosevelt's career and from the causes that she represented, by way as a bridge and a message to our times. Eleanor Roosevelt emerged as a social reformer at a very crucial point in American history. She became nationally known when her husband became president. And at that point, after the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, the only political means that Eleanor Roosevelt had, the only political power that she had, was in fact through her husband's office. It was much to her advantage that the position of First Lady had no definition and no clearly circumscribed boundaries, and had no official functions attributed to it. It was basically up to each First Lady to infuse the position with the particular contents and activities that that particular First Lady would choose to do. And as we know, most of the First Ladies who preceded Eleanor Roosevelt had defined that position as a ceremonial one. And the most baffling and bewildering to the American public, and the most shocking aspect of Eleanor Roosevelt's emergence on the scene, was that while she continued to maintain the ceremonial aspects of the position and wear Eleanor blue gowns for inaugurations and host musicians and dignitaries in the White House, at the same time, she translated and transformed that position into an instrument for emergency measures in an effort to alleviate the crisis and the suffering of the Great Depression. And eventually, she used that position at the White House as an instrument for achieving social reform. So that, in fact, rather than acting as an extension and as the female domestic suite counterpart of the president, she used the position of First Lady as an instrument for social reform. And this is perhaps the basic theme of her activity that had become most unforgivable to her enemies. Her enemies felt most betrayed by that very fact that she refused to remain confined in the sweet domestic sphere, and that she used her position in the manner in which she did it. And in fact, that kind of resentment and the sense of betrayal, first the sense of the members of her class that she had betrayed them by advocating the far-reaching, at that time, far-reaching social reforms which she did, and also the women, many of the women in general who had subscribed to the ideal of domesticity, were enraged by her conduct, and therefore they very brutally wrote to her often in public and in private, blaming the failure of her children on her public conduct, on her blaming the divorces and the failure of her children on Eleanor Roosevelt's neglect, what they perceived as neglect of her domestic duties. And perhaps one of the most vicious and pettiest letters that she received once was from a woman who claimed that when she was walking up the banister in the reception room in the White House, her white gloves got soiled with dust on the banister. And the letter said, rather than tearing about the country to be everybody's busybody, you'd be doing better to see to it that the dust is properly wiped in the White House. But psychologically, there was a much deeper resentment than the matter of shifting around dust that was expressed in that particular concern. Well, perhaps we should spend a few minutes now to understand what Eleanor Roosevelt's major role was in the White House and how she interpreted and perceived her role. And then I would like to look back at her emergence as a reformer and to see how that particular transformation of Eleanor Roosevelt can be placed into a larger tradition of the emergence of the American social reform movement from the so-called progressive era to the New Deal, and also how her position and emergence can be explained in the context of the emergence of women reformers in that first half or the first third of the 20th century. When Eleanor Roosevelt came to the White House, she was prepared in several ways for the support and the furthering of the causes which she was to advance. But she was by no means trained systematically, nor did she have a very clear social reform program any more than her husband. The most characteristic aspect about New Deal reform was the absence of a program, the absence of a plan. The New Deal was a response, an emergency response to a crisis of the Great Depression. And it is no coincidence that Franklin Roosevelt himself was able to rally public support to the emergency relief measures and the regulatory measures for business which he had immediately introduced by using a war terminology. The war analog of the New Deal is very dramatic, and the words of mobilization, war, crisis, battle were constantly present in his speeches. And it was simply because the memory of World War I and the emergency of World War I was still alive in people's minds that Franklin Roosevelt was able to rally that kind of war terminology in order to overcome the traditional opposition to the use of the federal government in the service of far-reaching relief and social reform measures. So that the New Deal itself was a clear example of pragmatism and of taking measures as they came step by step. At least the first Roosevelt administration was such, and it was not until after his re-election for the second term that there emerged a more systematic, cautious, but more systematic social reform plan. So that both, in fact, came into the White House. Both Franklin and Eleanor came without any clear and consistent plan. But Eleanor brought into the White House a training, the result of the apprenticeship that she had undergone through the 1920s. And that apprenticeship, that period during which she had apprenticed with various social reform organizations, particularly in New York State, she had herself become transformed from one who had been raised on a tradition of noblesse oblige, from the child who used to be sent by her stern but benevolent grandmother to carry baskets of wood and turkeys for Thanksgiving for the poor in the Hell's Kitchen district of New York, or from the young girl in the Junior League who used to go to Rivington Settlement House in New York when she was about 18 and see the suffering of the immigrant poor and the slum dwellers. She had become transformed over the 1920s from that kind of creature to one who had undergone training in understanding what the major issues of social reform and social justice were. And her own transformation during that period, in fact, is symbolic of an important ideological change that had taken place in American society from the late 19th century through the progressive era and until the New Deal. A transformation in the view of the causes of poverty, a shift from a social Darwinist approach which viewed poverty as a form of personal failure and which believed in the survival of the fittest, some of which has come back to us now, from that kind of view to a view of seeing poverty as being man-made, as being the result of a maldistribution of resources. So that her own training with these organizations symbolized, in fact, a major shift in American thought itself on problems of poverty and on social reform. And it was also reinforced, of course, by the political activities of the progressive movement on the state and on the national level, consummated for the first time in the reform program of her own uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, and then further implemented by Woodrow Wilson. So with that particular background, Eleanor Roosevelt found herself in the 1920s being trained by a whole variety of women's reform organizations. One of those was the Women's Trade Union League, where she first learned about the rights of labor, about the exploitation of workers, about the need for a fair minimal wage and for the protection of women in industry. The other was the National Women's Consumers League, which was headed by Florence Kelley, the founder, a brilliant lawyer and founder of the National Women's of that particular league. And Florence Kelley taught Eleanor Roosevelt not only the value of reform, but also the value of expose and of public raising public consciousness and of educating the public to accept such reforms, because that was the core of the National Women's Consumers League's type of activity. There were many other organizations, and the time here would not suffice to mention them all. But I think it is very important to emphasize the fact that the most crucial aspects of Eleanor Roosevelt's apprenticeship came from these types of organizations, such as the Women's Trade Union League and the National Consumers League, rather than from the women's suffrage organization. And that, even though Eleanor Roosevelt was very active in working with that organization as well, she never developed a commitment to the Equal Rights Amendment, for reasons that, if there is time, we can go into later. So the very important aspect about her exposure and preparation with these organizations is again linked very much with the historical place that these various voluntary reform organizations had in the history of American reform. The period when Eleanor Roosevelt encountered such organizations as the National Consumers League was the 1920s. It was a low period in the history of American reform. It was after World War I. It was the period of reaction against the Progressive Crusade. It was a reaction against, and a period of disillusionment after the high-pitched idealism that carried Woodrow Wilson into bringing American democracy to Europe. And the general mood was one of disillusionment with the Progressive Crusade, both at home and abroad. It was a period where, under the administration of Calvin Coolidge, the major mood was one of returning to normalcy, and there is actually no such word in the Oxford Dictionary, but it was the word that was invented by, I don't know if by Calvin Coolidge himself or by someone in his administration, but there were many similarities between the period of normalcy of the 1920s and our times now. And perhaps one of the greatest similarities, besides retrenchment and conservatism and the Supreme Court destroying just about all the reform and social justice measures that had been passed under the Wilson administration, including the child labor law. The first child labor law was thrown out by the Supreme Court in the 1920s. In addition to all that, the 20s were also marked by a retreat to individualism and to yoga and to pursuits of personal tranquility and so on. So that it was within that atmosphere when, in fact, historians had believed that American reform historians looking back had believed that American reform had come to a halt, and that the entire enormous energy of the voluntary organizations had come to an end. It was, in fact, in that very period that on the local level, as well as on the national voluntary level, these various reform organizations had continued to be active and had undergone a transformation in leadership from the kind of a voluntary crusader zeal that had been exemplified by Jane Addams by the genteel reformer of the first decade of this century. The nature of the leadership had been transformed to tough, professionally trained women, lawyers, and economists, such as Florence Kelley, who began to provide a very clear plan for social action. And it was also the period of the birth of the National Association of Social Work, a transformation from benevolent volunteer reformers to trained social workers. That was precisely the seedbed from which the social relief and the social reform plan of the New Deal had emerged, because the very people who then became Franklin Roosevelt's ministers of relief, Harry Hopkins, who became Roosevelt's major architect of the relief and the reform program, was a product of those particular voluntary reform associations from which the professional social work movement had emerged. And the same holds true for Frances Perkins, who had become Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor and who had been one of the chief architects of the Social Security Act. So that while on the national political level, American reform had almost come to an end in the 1920s, the tradition itself had been carried on by the local organizations, by the local networks, and it was that particular area that was the training ground for Eleanor Roosevelt. And when Franklin Roosevelt initiated the New Deal in 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt brought with her into the White House her mentors, some of her former mentors and associates who had developed and emerged during that particular period. And there is an important parallel between that, between those developments and between the gender gap in our times, because as Alice Rossi had explained, that if one wants to understand the gender gap in American politics, one should not just look at the national level and at national elections. One should look at the kind of networking that is going on locally on the state and on the community level. So that when Eleanor Roosevelt emerged in the White House, she brought with her not only the experience that she had gathered from these different organizations, she actually brought her networks with her. And the names of Frances Perkins and Harry Hopkins are perhaps the most well-known ones, but we could spend here hours to look at the entire network of the various relief administrators on the state level. We could look at various officials within the Roosevelt administration who had taken on crucial roles, but who had been brought there through these particular ties and also through Eleanor Roosevelt's activities in state politics in the state of New York during the 1920s, and through her activities in the national campaign, in Al Smith's campaign for presidency. Now, once she came into the White House, she began to use her position for a variety of activities, and she developed them as they emerged. On the public level, she became the self-appointed spokesman of the New Deal, and she saw her major role not simply in making the New Deal's measures known to the general public, but in fact in arousing the public conscience to an understanding of the kind of crisis that American society was facing. And from Eleanor Roosevelt's perspective, the crisis of the Great Depression was not merely an economic disaster. The Great Depression was a spiritual crisis. It was the end of the old order. It was a manifestation that many of the values that American society had subscribed to, particularly unbounded individualism and laissez-faire, had in fact become debunked, and that the government, including especially the federal government, had to begin to undertake a positive role and to become an honest broker state. That was the role which she defined for the government, to become an honest broker role, which was, of course, also very much the role that Franklin Roosevelt had attributed to the government in the early stages of the New Deal. As the educator of the public, Eleanor Roosevelt made thousands of speeches, and for the first time reached communities. It was the first time in 20th century American history that anyone associated with the presidency came to the most remote communities in the nation. She traveled thousands of miles all over, all the way to the remote areas in the Southwest, to small villages, talking to sharecroppers in the South. And the purpose of her travel was not simply to deliver speeches, but to act as the eyes and the ears of the president. And what she brought back to the White House were detailed and very careful reports of the conditions she saw. And she shared those reports not merely with the administrators, but with the public at large through her column. And so that the plight of the Depression and the plight of people whose suffering was intensified by the Depression, but who had been endemically poor for generations, suddenly became known nationwide. So Eleanor Roosevelt's role in providing the kind of expose that she had learned to do through the National Consumers League became very dominant. Within the administration itself, she became a channel to the president. And in fact, I should say in parentheses that when I decided to do my work on Eleanor Roosevelt, and it was my first project in American history when I came to this country, it was not because I was interested in Eleanor Roosevelt. I was interested in seeing how within the government, what kind of relationship and what kind of access voluntary organizations and individuals had on an informal basis in shaping policy within the federal government. And as it turns out, I was amply rewarded by what I found, because Eleanor Roosevelt's role was unique and crucial in that sense, in channeling not only the information to the president, but in channeling a whole variety, a host of proposals for new measures and for new programs, which individuals brought to her and which she then proposed to the president. And in doing so, she was ruthless. Her approach was way beyond of what any husband would normally want to tolerate from a wife, because whenever she proposed a plan and Franklin Roosevelt had a way of not listening when he didn't want to listen and of changing the subject rather politely but firmly. But whenever such a plan was proposed, Eleanor Roosevelt would repeat it again. And when it was ignored again, it would show up on the breakfast tray. And there was no escape. He was always suspicious of who would be showing up to dinner, because this is how the National Youth Administration, which gave employment to hundreds of thousands of unemployed young people, emerged. It emerged because Eleanor Roosevelt brought Aubrey Williams, who then became the architect and the director of the National Youth Administration, to dinner. And it was at those dinners that the ideas were first planted for a whole variety of these agencies. The same held true for the Social Security Act, when the idea for it began to develop in 1935. When I interviewed Frances Perkins was very affectionate towards Eleanor Roosevelt in her memories, but she was also quite condescending. Frances Perkins's attitude towards Eleanor Roosevelt was typical of the attitude of one who had considered herself as a trained professional woman who had achieved high political position, and who was rather patronizing and condescending towards this housewife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who had access to the president because she was his wife. And Frances Perkins would say in the interview, the president and I, and she minimized Eleanor Roosevelt's role in drafting the Social Security Act and in bringing it to the attention of the President, but the National Archives, the records in the National Archives, and the interviews, my interviews with a whole variety of other associates of Eleanor Roosevelt, had brought into very clear relief as to not only how the Social Security Act was first developed and drafted, but in fact how it had been pounded into the President's consciousness to the point where he could not escape it. Now, in doing this, I'm not trying to appear here as an Eleanor Roosevelt partisan and to present Franklin Roosevelt as someone who was indifferent or someone who had to be besieged in this manner. But what I think we should understand here is the tension between the two. That, first of all, Eleanor Roosevelt, in her own thinking and in her own aspirations for social reforms, was much more far-reaching than the President. Because, first of all, because of her personal exposure through her variety of travels, she was able to perceive the urgency of certain measures which the President had been unawares of. And he was grateful to her for that. He instructed her to do that. But secondly, through her travels, she became conscious of lasting inequalities in American society. The plight of blacks and sharecroppers and Indians and immigrants in slums whose suffering was simply precipitated, had been precipitated by the Depression, but was a result of long years of discrimination. And the President was less comfortable with hearing about those groups because dealing with those issues necessitated a more radical, quote-unquote, action. And he found himself, therefore, caught in a rather pragmatic political bind, because we know very well that even the very mild measures that he had passed had been identified later as communism and as the devil's measure. When I taught in Ohio in 1962, and I mentioned Franklin Roosevelt, one of my students came up afterwards and said, "You shouldn't mention his name. He was the devil." And I said, "Who told you so?" He said, "My father." So this kind of tension between Eleanor Roosevelt's more far-reaching expectations to bring about equality and social reform and between the pragmatic considerations in the New Deal was a very real one. But Eleanor Roosevelt did not, there were certain aspects of injustice and inequality that she would not tolerate. And in that case, she was unforgiving when she encountered the President's pragmatism. And that particular area was, of course, the area of civil rights. And here, this particular issue is a good example of the slow progress, of the progression from immediate relief reforms to the need for lasting social reforms, where there was a major area of tension and conflict between the President and the First Lady. During the New Deal, blacks benefited indirectly for the first time through the major New Deal's economic measures, through the relief measures in the FERA and the WPA and the whole variety of other measures of the alphabet soup. And Eleanor Roosevelt had become the self-appointed conscience in saying to it that blacks were not discriminated against under this variety of measures. In fact, she worked very closely, for example, with Mary McLeod Bethune, who had been a black leader and educator, herself born in slavery, and whom Eleanor Roosevelt appointed to the National Youth Administration to see to it that there was no discrimination against black youth. And across the board, there was a deep concern to make sure that these measures would be affecting blacks as well. But when it came to the question on whether the President would actually come out and support actual civil rights legislation, the issue that emerged immediately was the question of alienating, the President's fear of alienating Southern Democrats, and his anxiety that if he supported a legislation on civil rights, that in fact it would undermine the support he needed for the other emergency measures. And Eleanor Roosevelt, however, was uncompromising on this matter. And she supported Walter White, the head of the NAACP, in his proposal for anti-lynching legislation. And Walter White was one of those people who was brought to dinner many times, whether the president wanted it or not. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote later about her efforts in the anti-lynching, on behalf of the anti-lynching legislation. I also remember wanting to get all-out support for the anti-lynching bill and removal of the poll tax. But though Franklin was in favor of both measures, they never became must legislation. When I would protest, he would simply say, first things come first, and I can't alienate certain voters I need for measures that are more important at the moment by pushing any measures that would entail a fight. And as Franklin Roosevelt's biographer Frank Friedel put it, his attitude towards toward this whole issue of black equality was somewhat that would be similar to benign neglect, to the term that would have been used later in our times as benign neglect. But Eleanor Roosevelt made her position on the anti-lynching bill public, and she made her disagreement with the president public, and of course aroused the wrath of Southern whites and became one of their major targets for hatred and opposition. The anti-lynching legislation was never passed in the Roosevelt administration, but it very clearly demonstrated the distance between the president and the first lady in this respect. Moreover, in her personal conduct, Eleanor Roosevelt exemplified where she stood on the question of social equality, and again did it at the risk of alienating Southern voters. For example, in 1938, when she was giving a speech at the Southern Human Welfare Conference in Birmingham, the chairs on the platform were divided into two blocks. One was marked colored and one was marked white. And Eleanor Roosevelt went and sat down in the area marked colored. And she was immediately asked to move to the white side. She refused. Then the police interfered and they threatened to shut down the meeting. So under the threat of the police, she finally moved her chair into the middle in front of the two sections and put it closer to the colored side. And it was in this kind of personal conduct at a time which is inconceivable, I mean, to most of the students here, that given their age, at that time, Eleanor Roosevelt, through her personal example over and over again, conveyed this message about equality. Although all through the 1930s, she never mentioned the word desegregation. And it wasn't until the Truman and the Eisenhower administrations that she began to be even more radical herself and to talk about desegregation. Another important area in which Eleanor Roosevelt used her power and her position as First Lady was in testing legislation for the president. And in this respect, Eleanor Roosevelt served as the trial balloon for a whole variety of programs that the president had intended to bring before Congress. And in fact, the Social Security was one of them, because when he finally became persuaded that the time was ripe for the Social Security administration, she then wrote in her column, "I hope very much to see a security program really launched on its way, which will include old age pensions, a permanent ban on child labor, better employment insurance, better health care for the country as a whole, better care for mothers and children generally. I do not expect that program to be static, that is, that within 2 years we will have completely written a security program. But I hope it will be started. Many things will have to be changed year by year in as big an undertaking as this. But I hope we can get started." And by publishing this kind of program in her column and then by receiving thousands of letters, she was able to test the public mood and to convey that to the president. So that in a sense, many times while she used the president a great deal to further the causes that she was interested in, he was also using her to test the public mood and the public opinion. And while you sit here, when you sit here now and you hear me read this quote, and it sounds very bland, it sounds very mild, to have proposed this kind of social security program to the public. And in fact, it was very mild when we look at it in historical perspective, when we think of it, that Bismarck's Germany had already set the foundations for social security in the 19th century, and that Britain had already achieved much more than that at the beginning of the 20th century. And in the United States, it took a Great Depression and 1/3 of the nation to be ill-housed and ill-fed and ill-clad before one could even begin to propose anything like that. Nevertheless, it seemed very radical at the time, and it was necessary to test the public mood in this kind of manner. And the third major area, again, where she used her power and her influence, was in seeing that whatever measures had been inaugurated would actually be implemented. And here there are boxes of millions of letters from every agency in the New Deal where people were writing to Eleanor Roosevelt directly. And she read every letter personally. And she had very clear instructions as to how these letters should be dealt with. And wherever a person wrote that they were not receiving the proper treatment by a particular New Deal relief agency, she would then refer that letter to either directly to the administrator of that agency, or she would refer it to the committee woman of the National Democratic Committee in that particular state. And those women would then pursue it with the local agencies and would investigate the case. And this is how, on an individual, on a personal basis, the First Lady transcended the normal indifference and neglect that one would experience in this kind of bureaucracy, and each individual case was followed up. I know that it was followed up because there was a ream of correspondence pertaining to each of these cases. So that, in fact, if we summarize Eleanor Roosevelt's role in the New Deal, perhaps the word of ombudsman and watchdog would be best exemplify the very constructive and persistent role which she had assigned to herself. And in doing so, while watchdogging that the existing measures would be implemented, she gradually pulled both the thought and the activity in the direction of launching a more permanent social reform program. When talking to the American Youth Congress in 1939, she very clearly drew a distinction between stopgaps and temporary measures on the one hand, and between the need of building into American society some permanent measures of social security and social reform. And in formulating those measures, she very much used the concepts that Franklin Roosevelt articulated later as his 4 freedoms. And she said, "We have been afraid, all of us, really, to face the fact that this is an economic problem and that none of us knows the answer. These measures are only temporary stopgaps. There is no kidding ourselves. We have got to face these problems, and we have got to face them together. It is a cooperative thing if we are going to solve it. We have bought ourselves time. Is it going to be worth buying?" After the death of her husband, she continued to live and to function as the symbol of the New Deal, as the force of continuity of the American reform tradition that had been consummated, at least in one phase, through the New Deal. And as the guardian of the New Deal tradition, she began to hound, first of all, President Truman and afterwards Eisenhower, in saying to it that whatever gains had been achieved through the New Deal would be further expanded and implemented. And she again used her influence on the public to see to it that no matter what administration would come into the White House, the basic fundamental commitment to the beginnings of the welfare state that had been achieved through the New Deal would not be undermined. And if we think back of it at the history of those years, it is really extraordinary to realize that whatever administration came into power after Franklin Roosevelt's, with the only exception of the current administration, had maintained the basic commitment to the welfare state that had been, for which the ground had been laid in the New Deal. So perhaps this is a very important moment in American history. Perhaps we are very lucky that Eleanor Roosevelt's centennial is falling this year, because by celebrating her centennial, we are able to get some insight on the cyclical pattern of American social and political reform movements, of the peaking of a reform during the progressive era, its disappearance underground during the 1920s, its re-emergence in a new, much more matter-of-fact, but also more far-reaching form in the 1930s, and then its not necessarily linear path, but rather almost a continuous path, even through the Eisenhower years. And now that we are facing the risk of losing some of the very fundamental and yet very limited reforms that had emerged through the New Deal, perhaps remembering Eleanor Roosevelt will bring back to our consciousness the importance of not allowing that reform program to be lost. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sure. Sure. Yeah.
Harivan's going to answer questions for a few minutes, and then we'll take a break. Go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to point out that it was Warren Harding, not Coolidge, who coined the normalcy phrase. Harding did it, but my question
I'm sorry, you're right. You're right.
My question is, do you think that FDR would have pushed the civil rights measures in his last term if he had lived, and why did Eleanor Roosevelt use terms like desegregation and push for actual desegregation with it inside of husband's term?
Why did she or didn't she?
Why did she push for actual desegregation, use terms like that, and would FDR have enacted the civil rights measures in his last term?
Well, as an historian, I never speculate as to what would have been done, but there is a large body of literature, very, very good, a number of good books that had been written specifically about Roosevelt and the blacks, Roosevelt and civil rights, and that literature analyzes these issues very, very carefully. The reason he couldn't push for it in his last term was because of the war, because he had to mobilize support on the domestic front for the war. Now, as far as Eleanor Roosevelt, why did she not use such terms as desegregation, and why didn't she push, for example, for desegregation in the schools, is because we have to understand her and her contemporaries not from the point of view, from our experience after all this had been accomplished and we need more, but rather from the point of view of what their starting point was. And their starting point was one where it was very daring even to do what she did. and that in her own thinking, as I pointed out earlier, that her own thinking did not develop in any necessarily systematic way, and it did not contain a very clearly defined ideology or a very clearly constructed civil rights program, so that she used her personal conduct and she to exemplify the kind of equality she believed in, and she supported measures as they were brought to her. But for example, not even the NAACP proposed at that time desegregation, because that was considered much too far-reaching. More importantly, during World War II, at the risk of alienating people and at the risk of fragmenting a united domestic front, she became a dogged advocate of the Fair Employment Practices. And when the Fair Employment Practices Commission was established during World War II, she personally again began to supervise to make sure that there was equality in employment of blacks. And then when A. Philip Randolph organized the march to Washington, again Eleanor Roosevelt supported him and facilitated that march. Yes.
I'm curious, have the Eleanor Roosevelt's columns ever been published with either just alone or with a commentary and an analysis?
Yes, there have been selections of her columns were published in a volume called This Is My Day. The name of the column was This Is My Day. But I must say, having spent 1 year of my life reading every column, the amount of repetition and the amount of trivia in those columns is quite high in proportion to the also the very powerful and very important things that she had said. Yes.
You said you would mention something about Eleanor Roosevelt and equal rights. Do you want to say more about that, or you suggesting?
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt did not believe in the Equal Rights Amendment because it was just a decade prior to that the first protective legislation for women had been achieved in protecting women workers in factories and the whole variety of other protective legislation. And she felt, just like the argument that's used today, which is a false argument today, but she felt that an Equal Rights Amendment would undermine that protective legislation. Yes.
Eleanor Roosevelt established, along with millions of women, bathtub industries in her backyard, so to speak. How far reaching do you feel that this trial effort to bring youth and local people into working conditions, which and helping them learn trades, how far reaching do you think this was in influencing labor policies when she was?
Well, this was a very, very important part of it, because the whole idea of the kind of craftsmanship that was developed in Valkiel and the notion of training people to learn actual trades and also to bring them. She had a strong belief in the whole tradition of making things and in traditional crafts, and so that there was a very strong connection between that and the kind of shape that the NYA and afterwards also the Civil Conservation Corps had developed. There is a very clear connection between that. But I should say also that her involvement with Val Kiel goes way beyond that. It exemplifies an aspect of Eleanor Roosevelt's concerns and activities I didn't have time to touch here, and that is her commitment to American tradition of craftsmanship and to American folk culture and to American grassroots culture. And it's quite a contrast when one compares what Jackie Kennedy did in the White House in terms of the kind of cultural affairs that she sponsored and the cultural affairs that Eleanor Roosevelt sponsored. Eleanor Roosevelt brought folk artists into the White House, and as part of the WPA programs, of the WPA theater projects, she encouraged the revival of American plays, of indigenous American plays, and also the production of new plays. Clifford Odets, for example, owes the beginning of his career to the WPA theater project. And it was for the first time that small towns and remote communities all over the nation experienced live performances. And this magnificent volume of the Index of American Design, which is a magnificent collection of samples of American design, of every type of objects, were hand-painted by unemployed artists. The Index of American Design was another product of this same kind of spirit of recovering and preserving American culture and craftsmanship, so that there is also a link in that sense. Well, are there other questions? Or if there aren't, I'd like to make one point. I deliberately emphasized here Eleanor Roosevelt's public role and her role as a reformer and her emergence through training with different organizations. And I did not speak about the person. And I think that perhaps I should take a minute to say that even though she appeared to the public as a very simple and almost single-minded person, she was extremely complex, and that an understanding of that person is an enormous task in itself. But what the lesson of her life exemplifies is the extent to which a person like her overcame personal tragedy and harnessed whatever disaster had hit her personal life, primarily her own sense of personal failure in her marriage, in her family, her husband's affair with Lucy Mercer, her whole loss of confidence in her role as a wife, the ways in which she harnessed those personal disasters into public causes and into transcending her personal grief, into identifying with the pain of the world and devoting her life first to reform at home and subsequently carrying that reform to the world. I think that is a very special and very unusual example of what Erik Erikson had called the meeting of history and life history, because it was indeed a remarkable historical coincidence that the personal crisis in Eleanor Roosevelt's life history coincided with a time period which provided her with an unstructured, unprecedented role, but yet with one that gave her this particular opportunity to transcend her personal grief and her personal disaster into this very wide arena of public activity. And that transcendence should not be explained as simple an escape, as running into public activity to escape personal grief. People like Bernard Baruch, who had become a very close friend of hers, and when I interviewed Bernard Baruch, said that there were very rare occasions when Eleanor Roosevelt actually paid attention to her own pain, but those very few times she would come and she would cry in his office, and that she never overcame her personal grief, but she found a way of meeting the public needs at the point at which she encountered them. And I think that in thinking today, the rest of the day, about the various causes that she advocated, I think it's very important also to keep the whole person in mind. Thank you.